Hello, this is the My Thoughts podcast and my pseudonym is volk'in. Today we're going to break down a very high-profile topic, the Palestinian-Israeli war. Why did it start? What does the advance of Islamism in Europe have to do with it? And why does every other Westerner, who doesn't even care about the presidential elections in their own country, not forget to post a story in support of Palestine, yet is in no hurry to support Ukrainians, Uyghurs, or condemn anti-Semitism? Hello Greta, not to mention Russia, slave labor, and Iran's nuclear program. In short, this episode is titled Behind the Scenes in Gaza, The Price of Compassion or Feigned Kindness. The story with Palestine is a distortion of facts where someone attacks but the one defending is accused of excessive aggression. If you don't like Israel's killing of children, who are actually victims of jihad and radical European liberalism coupled with corruption, the consequences of which must inevitably be dealt with, I will point out one colossal difference between the actions of Israelis and Palestinians. What Israel is doing is military action for its own defense in response to aggression from the Islamic world. Yes, sometimes, for reasons beyond Israel's control, which will be repeatedly cited later, such forced steps cause suffering to Palestinian civilians. The deaths of these civilians are used by terrorist groups in the Gaza Strip for information operations to further whitewash themselves in the news feeds of Westerners who love to pity children, though admittedly only Palestinian ones. However, the responsibility for these deaths often lies directly with the Islamist militants themselves. Russia uses similar narratives in its war with Ukraine about war crimes allegedly committed against the civilian population in Russia's Kursk region, which were not fabricated, are committed by the Russians themselves. Or, there are civilians who produce drones in bakeries, or innocent students for whom assembling drones is part of the curriculum. And what the desperate and fanatical Palestinians are doing is terror, originating from their sick desire, no, not to create their own state and exist peacefully, but primarily to prevent the Jews from doing so, that is, from anti-Semitism. So as not to start the history of their confrontation from the creation of man, let's start from the end of the First World War. It is from this moment that the national movements of the Jewish and Palestinian peoples begin. And although they had historical lands of residence, namely Palestine, as a historical region in Western Asia, the truth is that it was taken from its previous owner, the defeated Ottoman Empire, and transferred to British control. After this, mutual hatred between Palestinians and Jews grew on what was then common territory, and there was a significant population increase for both nations, which of course led to pogroms against Jews and confrontations with Arabs. Britain didn't know what to do with all this and announced its desire to give up its mandate over these lands, adding that it could not offer a strategy to resolve the conflict. The Palestine question eventually passed to the newly created UN, where it was decided to divide the territory into two parts, an Arab one and a Jewish one. As for Jerusalem, which each side considered its capital, they wanted to give it a special status under UN administration. This is where things get heated, because the UN resolution was supported by the Jews who, while not considering it entirely fair, understood it was their chance for an independent state. But the Arab Higher Committee, the representation of Palestinian Arabs, along with the League of Arab States, LAS, flatly rejected the resolution's plan, opposing any division of Palestine, considering it unjust and seeking to prevent the creation of a Jewish state. Instead, they wanted the Jews to remain within a single Arab state on the territory of Palestine with guaranteed rights for the Jewish minority. And we all know what happens to Jews in anti-Semitic circles in the absence of an Israeli state, and consequently its protection. What solution would have been fair in a situation where lands previously occupied by one empire were handed over to another to create something sovereign and autonomous by different peoples with different religions and values living on the same territory is a rhetorical question. The world is generally unfair, although there are different methods of fighting for one's goals. Therefore, note that if the Palestinians had not pushed their national ideas and state building to the back burner, they could have gained independence that same year with all the derivatives, just like the Jews. But it was not to be because anti-Semitism came first, and here's what happened. On May 15th, 1948, one day after the declaration of the State of Israel, the armies of 5 Arab states, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, with the full support of the Arab Higher Committee, that is, the ruling elite of the unformed government of the unformed state of Palestine, invaded the territory that Israel considered its own, according to the partition plan and by de facto control. The main goal of the offensive was to liquidate the Israeli state. Although Transjordan and Egypt didn't forget to grab a piece of the Palestinian territories for themselves, which were intended for an Arab state, namely the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which was supposed to be no man's land, went to Transjordan, and the Gaza Strip to Egypt. Meanwhile, Israel made West Jerusalem its capital, a holy place, as they say, and also occupied about 60% of the territories allocated for the Arab state, concluding that Arabs near the borders of the God-given land were an unnecessary hassle, so they should be pushed further away. The methods were controversial but effective. Let's not forget that a significant part of the Palestinian people supported the attack on Israel in various ways, so everyone received a response without exception. Just as in the war with Russia, it's not Putin alone who is fighting, but the Russians, so the responsibility must be shared. Then in 1967, there was the Six-Day War, during which Israel responded to aggression from new and old losers, Egypt, Syria, now just Jordan, Iraq, Algeria, for whom things went completely off plan, as Israel now occupied parts of Egypt and Syria, and the Gaza Strip, along with East Jerusalem to boot. Some of it they returned, some received a semblance of autonomy, and some became a place where terrorism was reborn. And Jerusalem, Israel declared its one and indivisible capital. Subsequently, Palestine declared itself a state in 1988, and under agreements with Israel in 1994, the Palestinian National Authority was created, which had limited self-government in parts of the West Bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip. Later, in 2012, the UN granted Palestine the status of a non-member observer state, whatever that means. But in general, most countries in the world will soon recognize Palestine as a state. Slovenia, Spain, Norway, and Ireland recently did so in 2024, yet major Western players such as the US, UK, Canada, France, and Germany have not yet officially recognized the state of Palestine. A fixation on a specific, particular cause for one's failures or problems, which seems overwhelmingly important to a person, can turn an active person into a fanatic. Maxim Yakovlev, Conspiracy Theories. Nothing has changed, no one has reflected. On the contrary, in 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian parliamentary elections, receiving a majority of the votes. Due to ideological differences between the political movement Fatah, which had a majority in parliament before 2006, and Hamas, events unfolded that divided Arab Palestine, this time by the Palestinians themselves. Fatah retained control of the West Bank with autonomous structures that control Palestine's international contacts and, most importantly, negotiations with Israel. And although Fatah's official policy recognized the State of Israel, its internal charter, which contains calls for the destruction of Israel, has not been formally changed, reminiscent of Russia's foreign policy. As for Hamas, they seized control of the Gaza Strip through armed conflict. Civilized countries have recognized it as a terrorist organization for numerous crimes against its own people and terrorist acts against Israel, and they, in turn, have reshaped their national identity, adopting just one fanatical idea, the very one where it all began, the attempt to destroy Israel. And since this is the same as vacuuming sand in a desert, a completely pointless endeavor, though not for terrorists, because if the goal is impossible to achieve, then the jihad will last forever, like the Soviets' path to a bright future, which means terror and jihadists of various stripes will have a mandate for their subversive activities. But anyone who has read Orwell's 1984 knows that Hamas doesn't really care about Israel or Palestine. The main thing is power. The most recent high-profile event occurred on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas carried out an attack on Israel of unprecedented scale and brutality. It was a coordinated land, sea, and air operation, resulting in the deaths of over 1,200 people, including hundreds of civilians, with about 250 more taken hostage and transported to Gaza. One of the most famous targets of the attack was the Nova Music Festival, where terrorists shot 378 people and took another 44 hostage, some of whom were also killed. In response, on October 9th, Israel announced a complete siege of Gaza, cutting off water, gas, and electricity supplies and halting the delivery of all cargo. It was stated that these actions are part of the fight against Hamas and are intended to exert pressure for the release of hostages and to achieve the complete defeat of the terrorists. However, with the assistance of the US, Israel later agreed to allow limited humanitarian aid to enter through the Egyptian border. As I was editing this text, it turned out that Israel had attacked Iran's nuclear facilities, declaring war on them. And since Iran is one of the main sponsors of Hamas, we will talk more about the benefits of such cooperation. Consequently, Israel is forced to control the situation in Gaza to prevent the development and manifestation of terrorism. But it's not just Israel, as other members of the Arab League also oppose Hamas in various ways. Because, after all, radicalism does interfere with cooperation with the outside world, as well as with the sale of oil in general. But, oh wonder, the Jews are always to blame for everything, and more on that later. Israel's methods in combating terrorism have always been a subject of debate, but the reason for their use always remains the same: attacks by radical Islamists, and you will see a little later what inaction or softness in the face of jihad leads to. The main thing to understand is that it is impossible not to respond to Hamas attacks, impossible to negotiate with them, and impossible for terrorists to adhere to the rules of war or any international norms and acts. As I mentioned at the beginning, the civilian population is often used as a human shield. Furthermore, the Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated regions in the world, with about 2.1 million people in 365 square kilometers, 5,967 people per square kilometer. Therefore, unfortunately, it is simply impossible to avoid collateral civilian casualties. Some will say that Israel doesn't even try. However, as we already know, the population is not innocent, not even if it supports acts of aggression with silent consent. Did the Palestinians support Hamas's seizure of power? Some did. Some who disagreed fled, and the rest were repressed. Does the idea of collective responsibility contradict international humanitarian law? Yes. And does the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, which targets civilians and all living things to avoid casualties on the defending side, also contradict it? Also yes. But should the innocent die to deter the enemy by more humane methods? Should American soldiers have given their lives instead of a nuclear attack to save the lives of civilian Japanese while Japan was waging war? It seems obvious to me that people conveniently forget who elects the government and who legitimizes its decisions. Therefore, when, despite all efforts, Israel fails to prevent civilian casualties, it is not a tragedy, it is the consequence of their support, active or passive, for the war against Israel. And what about the children? According to the WHO, almost half of the population of the Gaza Strip is under 18, which makes it even harder to avoid casualties among children, especially when children become legitimate targets because they are recruited into armed groups. Russia does the same with abducted Ukrainian children. It transforms, re-educates children into living weapons for the war against Ukraine, and the argument that right now they are just children who could have had a chance at a future overlooks one thing. Unlike Ukraine, which is fighting to bring abducted children back home, no one in the world is making even the slightest effort to change the environment of Palestinian children to change their future. They grow up in the specific conditions of Islamic jihad among terrorists, meaning they are raised by terrorists, and their chances of becoming someone else are slim. It's laughable to even talk about re-educating a million children when the average family can't even tame the adolescent temper of their own children. Is it enough to just destroy Hamas? Unfortunately, no, because they are not the only, though currently the main, militants in the Gaza Strip. There are other formations. And let's remember Afghanistan. When some left, others came, the Taliban, who imposed strict Islamic rule after a devastating civil war, were overthrown by a US-led invasion in 2001, but quickly returned and captured almost the entire country after US troops withdrew in 2021, because there is a lack of national political will. The only thing we can really do is to curb Islamism at home, in Europe, in America. This is the only way to influence the flourishing of jihadist terror and its consequences for children. And should we try to offer a Western European liberal vision of the world to every child born into Islam? Or should we turn our attention to external events, namely the jihad that is breaking into Europe, which we will talk about next? For now, I'll add that we must remember freedom is not given, it is won. Therefore, in my opinion, the events in Palestine signal a loss of national identity by a significant part of its population. As I said, they exchanged it for anti-Semitism, becoming similar to Russians, nothing of their own. Everything is based on fighting against what is foreign. One might object that Palestinians lack the resources to resist, that they have a humanitarian crisis, but the Palestinians themselves brought it upon themselves by choosing Hamas with its course of destroying Israel instead of a peaceful settlement, as Fatah at least tries to do. But unfortunately, Fatah cannot do it all alone. For this, at least a partial political ensemble of the powers that be must be involved. So, after Hamas forces seized full control of the Gaza Strip, Israel and Egypt began a land, sea, and air blockade of the region, which led to a sharp deterioration in living conditions. But where have you heard anyone protesting against the Egyptians? And they, in turn, also have the Rafah checkpoint on the border with the Gaza Strip. And although Egypt usually coordinates its actions regarding humanitarian cargo for Palestinians with the US and Israel, Israel, there is still evidence of excessive bureaucratization of these processes on the part of the Egyptian authorities, who of course shift the blame to Israel, and this is not surprising, as they are also at odds with Hamas, who in turn have for years received resources for military operations by regularly confiscating humanitarian aid for their own benefit, using dual-use goods from there, and even used tunnels under the UN headquarters and at least one hospital as command centers. Again, regarding the terrorist tactics aimed at discrediting Israel's actions by using their own people as human shields. Moreover, there is evidence of the involvement of UN employees in the attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. But of course, the UN and other pro-Palestinian organizations deny everything and when possible try to hide discrediting facts, and the far-left liberals believe them, or at least pretend to believe them. You can guess what motivates them or just keep reading. Spoiler money. Because you know these Jews, there are always some problems in the world because of them. Even Hitler was a Jew, so people say. Here again, an interesting picture emerges, where Western consumers of informational slop gladly accept as truth the Russian fairy tale that Ukraine is supposedly selling military aid from its allies, but refuse to believe that Hamas, a terrorist organization, steals humanitarian aid from its own people to sell it back to them, strengthening its control over the population, on which the terrorists' power in the region largely depends. Unfortunately, this is not surprising because the UN and other pointless organizations have long been providing their services to whitewash the reputations of both the Kremlin and other players like Hamas. I'll let you in on a secret. Here in Ukraine, humanitarian not military aid is resold in second-hand shops and elsewhere. It is even more likely to be misused in Gaza, where chaos and a humanitarian crisis reign, and yes, it's a vicious circle. The humanitarian crisis breeds more violence and gives terrorists more power and support, but at the same time, it is a response to the violent actions of militants who use aid and the structures of Palestine's partners to their advantage. But this can be worked on how exactly is a topic for the last section. As for Ukraine and Israel, they should work on repelling information attacks, although perhaps the missile strike on the state broadcaster in Iran counts. And if you still disagree with Israel's actions, let's move on to what radical liberalism in Europe has led to, along with an impotent migration policy that did not compel Islam to integrate into secularized Europe. Europe's growing Muslim population Muslims may have a specific vision of life in countries with Western values, and specifically we are talking about Islamism, which believes that Sharia law is above all else. At the same time, often the Muslim population, especially the youth under the influence of religious groups financed from abroad by the Islamic lobby, does not recognize the jurisdiction of European institutions, only Sharia courts, and that's 50% of people under 25 in France alone. And how did it happen that France, which began to secularize back in the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century and received a powerful impetus during the French Revolution, cementing everything with the law on the separation of church and state in 1905, became the country with the largest religious Muslim population, along with Sweden in Western Europe, and how exactly did it pay for it? One of the primary reasons for the increase in the Muslim population in Europe is the European migrant crisis of 2015, caused by conflicts, wars, and instability in Syria, the Middle East, and Africa, as well as a negligent migration policy on the part of the EU, which was based on feelings of guilt, sacrifice, and pity, but with a complete absence of working mechanisms to influence the integration of refugees into Western society. It was more like animal hoarding or Noah's syndrome, when people try to save more animals than possible, bringing home everyone indiscriminately, thereby creating unbearable conditions for them and for themselves, which is very unwise. And it was the reckless left-wing forces that planted a bomb under the European foundation. And of course, there was no shortage of love for Russia, because instead of a powerful response, or at least rational sanctions for the attacks on the civilian population of Syria, which actually caused a powerful wave of refugees from there, Russia received a limp concern from the US and the EU, and sanctions against a few individuals that had no effect. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And from the construction of Nord Stream 2 in general, one can guess how deep the indifference to Syrians or Ukrainians was. The Palestinians are another matter. Although the story with Palestine is no less disgusting, I will explain why later. After fleeing their troubles, refugees continued to live by their own rules, refusing or being unable to learn the local language, adhere to local laws and social norms without the threat of deportation. And if you immediately object, deportation was provided for by law, then I will explain how it actually worked. Deportation is an extreme measure that should be applied to migrants who have committed a serious crime, but one could always appeal such a decision in court, which dragged out the process for months or years, as there were enough cases to overload the judicial system. Along with this, there is a principle that prohibits returning a person to a country where there is a threat to life or persecution, and if you compare the EU and the migrants' home countries, they are all dangerous. What can you say when Spain refuses to extradite the propagandist Shari to Ukraine, citing persecution by the Ukrainian authorities? Although given the restless life of propagandists in Spain itself, they would clearly be safer in an SBU detention center. In conclusion, there is simply nowhere to put the untrustworthy part of the population, as you cannot isolate everyone. And even if you could, they wouldn't become safer after that. And why were they accepted in the first place? Is it worth talking about the cost, as deportation is a logistically complex and financially expensive process, which is further complicated when the countries of origin refuse to accept their own citizens? So we get a picture of a clash of civilizations, people with different views on religion, attitudes towards women, sexual minorities, Western sociocultural norms, and generally without the desire to change anything when you can build your own good Russia in law-abiding Europe. Oops, I got confused. The situation is too similar to the Russian liberals. Now we can observe the consequences in the form of anti-migrant riots in Ireland, which began as a peaceful protest, and this is just one of many future outbreaks of anger. Yes, from history we see that pogroms are a common way to shift responsibility for all problems onto foreigners, at a time when they may require complex solutions and sometimes have nothing to do with them at all. Then right-wing radical populists gladly ride the wave on which they can raise their ratings by fighting, as a rule, against Jews, although other people of non-Nordic appearance are also suitable for this cause. And so it begins. People vote for strong politicians who offer to establish order with quick solutions, adding fuel to the fire, and then you get all sorts of Orbans, Ficos, and lovers of something white during live debates. But it is quite unequivocal that many of Europe's modern problems began with the degradation of left-wing forces, who opened the doors to all whose culture does not provide for the existence of other cultures, or at least their reconciliation. There is a secularized Europe, in which even the church evolves over time, changing its views on what is acceptable, its approach to believers, and even its role models. Read more in the book Religion Must Die by Vyacheslav Agayev. And then there are those who dress women in hijabs and are firmly convinced of the need to live by the laws of a book that is, to put it mildly, outdated, the interpretation of which inevitably stumbles upon jihad, which, no matter how you try, will find a place to justify violence. And here let's talk about humanity again. Should EU citizens largely sacrifice their comfort and safety for the comfort and safety of others, those who do not want to change nor become tolerant and open-minded without extreme coercion? If your answer is yes, they still should, then tell me, why are the rights of some more valuable than the rights of others, to the point of restricting them for the former? That is, to consciously make the lives of one's own citizens more tense and dangerous. And why should my state place the freedoms of others above my own, returning to the civilians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the lives of American soldiers, whose lives are more valuable, is determined only by the citizenship of the observer? We don't rush into the savannah to save zebras from lions because it's absurd, because we don't have the means to allow zebras to coexist with us, except in zoo cages, which is not a rescue. We'll turn a blind eye to the hungry lion cubs. It is just as absurd to try to save all the needy by giving them fish instead of helping them learn to fish in their own land. What will you do with them next? Turn them all into Europeans? This is both impossible and even sounds colonial. This is what European extreme liberalism is about, when a poor cat from the street is brought to a vet clinic and left, forgetting that someone then has to pay the bills for cleaning up the shit, about the transformation into Europeans, or rather the opposite. Another risk factor for the EU is the rapid growth of the Muslim population. As is known, religious people, as well as poorer segments of the population, have more children than less religious members of society with higher incomes. Europe has long been experiencing a demographic crisis against the backdrop of an improving standard of living. This makes the birth rate of Muslims, with their specific values, higher compared to the birth rate of people who adhere to European values. And this is a real threat when a foreign culture can displace the local one. In fact, this is what Islamist lobbies are trying to do, actively pouring colossal oil money into this process. At the beginning of the section, I mentioned Islamist lobbies. They truly have a powerful influence, and only relatively recently has Europe launched a fight against jihad. 2015 became a turning point for reviewing the strategy and methods of influencing Islam after a series of terrorist attacks attacks in France, which began with the attack on the office of the satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo, Paris, as revenge for caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. The event caused a significant resonance and was regarded as an attack on freedom of speech. The deadliest terrorist attack took place on November 13th, where at least 130 people were killed and hundreds were injured. But it's not just about terrorist attacks, as Islam has also calibrated its strategy of expansion. Attempts to buy a place under the sun with oil money is a new method, and unfortunately, it works much more effectively than big bada boom. One can recall the corruption scandals when Qatar, where human rights are something mythical, bought the right to host the World Cup, all in the spirit of the Soviet Union and the Olympic Bear, or the 1936 Olympic Games in the Third Reich. But these are just trifles, as Islam has long penetrated European politics and woven a web of its points of influence. Let's take, for example, the number of mosques in France and compare it, well, for example, with the number of synagogues, 2,500 versus just over 500. One might think that the Jews are settling in Israel, but this is like with the Russian Orthodox Church, FSB. A mosque is a place of influence and brainwashing, where advantageous narratives are instilled. How else can one explain that 70% of imams, those who lead prayers in a mosque, in France are not its citizens? And it so happened that a report submitted to Macron after an investigation he initiated on the grounds of a threat to the nation states that the Muslim Brotherhood, an Egyptian organization whose offshoot formed Hamas, is trying to undermine French society by promoting political Islam through local organizations, schools, charitable and sports programs. The report also points to funding of the Muslim Brotherhood network from Qatar and Kuwait, the use of European organizations to promote their ideology, and the infiltration of Islamists into the Republican institutions of France. This all hints at the fact that the so-called compassion and tolerance for Muslim refugees may be bought, being just a political tool in the hands of Islamists, for whom the suffering of those same Palestinians plays into their hands. This is especially beneficial for Iran, which finances Hamas to weaken and distract the IDF's attention from a serious nearby threat, the creation of nuclear weapons for a strike on Israel. As we can see, it failed. A collateral benefit from such collaboration is the world community's condemnation of Israel for its forced responses in Palestine. Harsh responses, but much more effective than concern. It would be a great success for Islamists if this were to begin the isolation of Israel. The absence of important steps towards establishing peace in the Gaza Strip on the part of Israel's critics is another marker of the rottenness that stinks up this whole story. One can guess that an artificial food shortage will not help correct the political views of the Palestinians, rather the opposite, yet no one in the world, especially the most vocal players, is in a hurry to lay the foundation for establishing a new alternative governance structure in Gaza to complete the process of overthrowing Hamas, which Israel began. On the eve of the war, the terrorist government apparatus numbered thousands of employees and officials, distributed across numerous ministries. Although only a small fraction of these individuals was involved in terrorist activities, this bureaucracy was crucial for maintaining control over Gaza. Now, only a shadow of them remains, but since the war is still ongoing and the terrorists are striving to maintain control in any way possible, particularly through the distribution of humanitarian aid, comprehensive measures must be taken to establish order. It is worth focusing on Hamas's shadow governance, undermining their propaganda, preventing their control over humanitarian aid, and preserving bureaucratic processes in Gaza without giving room to terrorists. Instead, the world community is putting pressure on Israel, trying to force it to leave Gaza while Hamas is waiting for this moment to fully revive itself. So this is the game of kindness, simple solutions, and easy money. And Israel may not even need it. The main thing is to eliminate the threat, and the lives of Palestinians, in light of the events there, are not a priority at all. Remember the nuclear umbrella in world wars? Only those who do not currently have to defend themselves tell you how to defend correctly and justly. In reality, the rules designed to protect civilians during war somehow easily evaporate when the time comes. This can be seen now in the example of how country after country is withdrawing from the Convention on Cluster Munitions because aggressors have never been interested in any customs of warfare, and not everyone wants to lose to them in the variety of weapons. So why does everyone so support the trend of compassion for Palestinians while remaining indifferent or unequally supportive of, for example, the Uyghurs, exploited as slaves in mainland China because of cheap goods? Ukrainians who suffer from daily brutal killings by Russians because of the mysterious Russian soul, or the Jews themselves because if there's no water in the tap, it means the Jews drank it. This may require a whole separate story, but the main factor always remains petrodollars. What we have in conclusion, I would add that one should definitely be careful with the idea of collective responsibility, for the reason that dictatorships and right-wing radicals love to use it, right, all Jews are bad, Ukrainians are Nazis, and migrants are a guarantee of high crime. But the international community avoids this topic, starting from the Nuremberg trials, where there were many of its own reasons, including economic ones, to this day, when sanctions, if they are introduced, are usually only against specific individuals or institutions, and corporations are in no hurry to leave the markets of terrorist countries, justifying it by saying that without their essential goods, such as Coca-Cola and chips, the innocent Russian liberal will suffer. At the same time, if not for the collective cooperation of millions of people, if not for their resistance, we would still see the Soviet Union on the map of reality and slavery in the US. What we have now was not given to us, it was taken. We did not meditate on who owes us our freedom, we fought for it. No one owes it to anyone. It is the responsibility of citizens for where they are and what they have. The government of a country is the consequence of the choice of its citizens. It is its hand, its direct extension. Therefore, we need to decide, are we living in an era of kings and empires, or has the national revolution long since occurred? Are the Palestinians a people, or have they lost their identity and are now subjects of Hamas? World leaders can intervene, start searching for difficult solutions to preserve what is there. But these should not be attempts to stop Israel without a ready alternative, just to let Hamas recover. This is not help for the Palestinians. There is no need to look for a golden mean here. One should learn to distinguish between good and bad intentions by countering propaganda as the main assistant of the axis of evil. And if someone commits aggression, then first we condemn the offender. We fight back, and only then do we figure out how hard to punch them in the face, and not try to counter escalation by putting pressure on the defending side, giving the attacker time to regroup its forces. Hello, Trump. As can be seen from the latest news, Israel did in a few days what the US, led by Trump, couldn't do in 60. Iran is ready for any deal. The nuclear threat has been postponed. The production of components is shattered. One can only imagine the effect Israel will achieve by applying a little more force instead of empty talk about peace and agreements. Meanwhile, the world is picking its nose, not losing hope of appeasing dictators with gifts in the form of territories of those who are not particularly pitied, chanting calls for peace against all that is bad and for all that is good. International law does not work without force. Without force, it is just paper with nice words. And with you was volk'in. You've been listening to my thoughts. All sources and links to the facts I mentioned or the theses I voiced can be found in the text version via the link in the description, and there you will also find a link to my Instagram, where there will be even more of my thoughts in my stories. Also subscribe to the channel, and see you next time.